Uh, Thank you so much for having me today. I want to thank the partnership for doing this and for the work that you do. As a former local elected official for many years, I learned very, very quickly in San Francisco that nothing happened unless the region would work together. And I think so often we get tempted to be siloed. This is my neighborhood or my city, and that's all I have to care about, but everything is interconnected, and so regional partnerships make all the difference in the world. So thank you for the work that you do. One of the transitioning from local government to representing San Francisco and part of San Mateo County in the state Senate, there is still this interesting dynamic where people say, just focus on where you represent. Don't really worry about any other parts of the state. And similar to cities being interconnected in regions, our regions, we're all also dependent on one another, and we rise or fall together. And so I think it's so incredibly important, no matter where you represent, to know what's happening in other parts of the state and to really have those collaborations. And I saw very quickly upon taking office and sort of surveying the lay of the land in many parts of California, that the housing problems that we've struggled with for many, many, many years in San Francisco are now almost everywhere. And I think there's this, it used to be, it was all about, there were a few cities, San Francisco, West Hollywood, parts of LA, Santa Monica, a few others, Berkeley, that were really expensive, and everything else was, at least okay. And that, if that was ever true, that is certainly not true now. And we look at the amount of housing instability in California and what's happening with working families and homelessness and seniors, it's at a crisis point, and it's in more and more cities. And so we have to work together. And so I appreciate the outreach, because we need to all be connected on this sort of foundational issue to a happy and healthy and prosperous society, housing. But sort of backing up, when I look at where California is today, if you look at California in the 20th century, we in many ways defined the United States of America. This state drove so much. We drove the culture of this country. International perceptions, when people would think what's American, they would think about a lot of times California, whether it's the beach or whether it's Hollywood or whatever else. We defined for so many years what it was to be American. We played such a critical role in driving the economy of the country to the point where we're now the 5th largest economy in the world if we were our own country, which sometimes it feels like we are. And so we did it by doing things differently. We just did things differently in California, and we were willing to try new things and innovate. And we constantly welcomed new people into this state. People were just constant, whether it was people coming from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, or LGBT people immigrating here, or immigrants from Latin America. That's what we were as a state. So now in 2018, it sometimes feels in a number of areas, and this happens with societies, with communities, that we're a little bit stuck in the 20th century in a number of issues. That there are some critical areas that maybe it was fine to do it that way in 1950 or 1970, but it's not working anymore, or it's not working for everyone anymore. And it's a number of areas. When you look at water, that we have a system designed many, many years ago for a dramatically smaller state that just doesn't work anymore in an era of 40, pushing at some point 50 million people, and we don't have enough water, and we don't do enough water recycling, and we don't regulate groundwater enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a system that's stuck 100 years ago that we need to drag into the 21st century. And as an aside, I just want to thank my colleague in the Senate, Senator Bill Monning, for his extraordinary work, and I know he won't give up to make sure that everyone has clean and safe drinking water, which I know is a huge problem in this part of the state and in many other areas as well. In California, we used to build a lot of great infrastructure, ranging from our freeway system to BART, so many different great pieces of infrastructure that allowed this state to flourish. And then we sort of got away from that, and we stopped investing. We sort of sat on our laurels, and we need to drag that into the 21st century in terms of reinvesting in infrastructure. We did it with our criminal justice system, where we were on the lead in the 20th century of what was supposed to be the right way of doing things, tough on crime, and just if you send a bunch of people to prison and keep them there, you're going to make communities safer. And then we learned that's not the case. And so we are trying to now drag our criminal justice system into the 21st century so we don't have mass incarceration, so that we actually believe in rehabilitation and mental health treatment and addiction treatment and so forth. So all these areas where we're just trying to turn the corner and say, this is not California of 1950 or 1970, it's 2018, we're a different state, we need to do things differently. Housing absolutely falls in that category. And in fact, in some ways, it's the prime example of we started to do things a certain way in California, and it doesn't work anymore. And we are paying the price right now. I recently read a history that I didn't even know about. I felt sort of foolish that someone who does so much housing work, I didn't know about this history. That in the 1940s, we had almost like national rent control in the United States. It was around the war and the post-war era, there was a huge housing shortage, and there was federal requirements around rent control, and cities had to opt out of rent control. And by the early 1950s, rent control had gone away almost everywhere except New York City. Why? Because we were building so much housing starting in the 40s into the 50s and then into the 60s, just a huge national boom in housing construction that cities didn't feel the need, like they needed rent control anymore. There was enough housing for everyone. It wasn't perfect, but that's what happened. And when you look at when did the modern rent control movement start again, if anyone remembers any of that, it was in the 1970s. It was when the movement started. 79 was when it was adopted in San Francisco, and then into the 80s in other cities. That was also the time when we stopped building housing in California. You stop building housing, and guess what? Rents explode, and people start getting evicted, and there's pressure and a need to make sure people can stay in their homes. And so when we look at the problems that we're having in California, we have a 3.5 million home deficit in the state of California, 3.5 million, which is about equal to the housing deficit in the other 49 states combined. This is a deep hole that we have. And we see the consequences. We see more and more people living on our streets. And not just there are people who are mentally ill, who have addiction challenges. We certainly see that on the streets of San Francisco. We see it elsewhere. But that's just one piece of it. There are plenty of homeless people who are not mentally ill, who are not addicted, who simply cannot afford anywhere to live, who are living in their cars, who are living in RVs, who are living in shelters, who are couch surfing, and that is growing. We see young families who are concluding there's no place for me here. We basically put up a sign saying you're not welcome here because at some point you have a kid, you have a second kid, you need more space, and there is nowhere for them to afford in more and more parts of the state. And so we have working families that are being pushed either very far away from where they work or maybe even leaving the state entirely. And then, of course, we start exporting our housing problems to Reno and to Denver and to other cities where tons of Californians are moving and then turning those states blue, which I'm a Democrat, so that's a good thing from my point of view. But the problems sort of end up spreading. We see it with the real crisis among renters in this state, and I know we just had a huge rent control measure on the state ballot, and I know there was one locally, and it's always very controversial, and even in San Francisco, where we've had rent control for 40 years, there's still we were almost split 50-50 on Prop 10. But regardless of one's view on rent control, we have renters who are just really struggling with huge rent increases, people who look at the lay of the land. And I had a neighbor a few years ago, an older gentleman, who came up to me on the street and said, Scott, I am absolutely terrified because I saw my landlord painting my apartment building. Now, you would think people would be thrilled that the landlord was painting their apartment building, but he saw that as a precursor to selling the building, which would mean everyone would be evicted from the building. And that's where we've gotten to in too many parts of the state, a state where we have a large renter population that is increasingly unstable. And people fear that if they lose their apartment, they're done. Or if their rent goes up by 20%, they're done. They're not going to be able to find anywhere. We've also disinvested in affordable housing. We have, as a state, we eliminated redevelopment. We've not done enough in terms of subsidized housing for low-income people. And then, of course, overlaying all of it, we've adopted in California what I like to refer to as a housing last policy, a de facto policy that it's not a priority in California to have enough housing for everyone. And we've done that in a few ways. We've done it through zoning, where we have allowed cities to adopt incredibly low-density zoning and to effectively ban apartment buildings. It's called single-family home zoning. People don't like to talk about it. I grew up in a single-family home. It's nothing against single-family homes. They're great. But in vast swaths of this state, including 70% of San Francisco, dense urban San Francisco, it is illegal to build anything other than a single-family home or maybe a 2-unit building. Illegal. So where I live, a block from a subway station, you can't build anything larger than a 3-unit building. It's illegal. And so we have areas of the state that are job centers with lots of jobs, that have maybe access to public transportation, and we don't actually allow people to live there because we've said you can only have a single-family home, maybe on a 1/4 acre of land, and so we limit the number of people. And when you ban apartment buildings, you're also banning affordable housing because no one develops affordable single-family homes. It's multi-unit. And so what we've done through this hyper-restrictive zoning, even in job centers and even near public transportation, is to push people further away, to push people out and to create more and more sprawl, cover up farmland, cover up open space, build in wildfire zones. And since 1990, almost half of all housing built in California has been in wildfire zones. So the two issues definitely interrelate. And you push people into crushing commutes where people are commuting an hour and a half, 2 hours, and that means that they are undermining our climate goals because even though we've been reducing our carbon emissions in California, the one area that's been going up is transportation, which is 40% of our carbon emissions. And electric vehicles are great, but study after study has shown that we will never solve that problem just with electric vehicles. We have to make it easier and more affordable for people to live near where they work so that they, even if they can't use transit, even if they're driving, and many people need to drive and there isn't transit everywhere that it should be, that at least people maybe are driving 15 minutes to work or 20 minutes to work instead of an hour and a half or 2 hours. So the zoning is just a huge challenge in terms of it represents what is legal to build and not build. How much housing are we actually going to allow? And when you need 3.5 million homes to dig ourselves out of this hole so that people can stop becoming homeless and so that families stop having to leave and so forth, you have to look at making sure that you are actually legalizing the housing to be built in the first place. But then, even if we allow housing, when you have zoning that allows for the housing that you want to have, we have created a process where it can take years, maybe even 5-10 years, to get housing approved, even if it's within the zoning. So yeah, we'll zone it for a 10-unit apartment building, but it's going to take you 5 or 7 years to get it approved. And that there are a lot of different factors in that. There's CEQA, there is local conditional use and appeals and lawsuits. And I've seen it in San Francisco. I've seen it in other parts of the state where even modest developments that are entirely within zoning take years and years to get approved. And we did that because we're not just a big D democratic state. Even before we became a big D democratic state, we were a small d democratic state. And I'm a believer in community participation. I was the president of my neighborhood association. But at some point, you have to have a process that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and predictability, that if you zone for something, it's actually going to be built. And when we force these lengthy approval processes, what it does, it could mean the project never happens because it runs out of money. Time is money. It's incredibly expensive to have to go through a 5-year approval process. The project could get shrunk down because in the end, the developer, whether it's a nonprofit affordable housing developer or a market rate developer, says, you know what, fine, I'll cut the project in half. I just have to get it built because I can't carry it anymore financially. And it means that we have a delay in producing much needed housing. And so we're trying to address these issues. They all started for good reasons, right? We all want community participation. We all want strong environmental protection. We all want local control. But at some point, you have to look at the results. And the results are very, very clear. When you look at a 3.5 million home gap, when you look at the reality that we are supposed to be producing 180,000 units of housing a year in California, and in practice, we produce less than half of that. So the deficit grows and grows and grows, and the human problems that it causes grow and grow and grow. And so what are we doing about that? And I don't mean to be all gloom and doom. This is the best state of all the 50 states. This is an amazing place. I chose to make it my home. I moved here because of what California represents, as did I'm sure many people in this room. This is an amazing state that knows how to solve problems, and we just need the political will. It's not rocket science. It's all completely solvable, and we're working really hard to do that. And one of the issues that I think we're trying to grapple with, which is at the heart of not all of it, some of it's money for affordable housing, some of it is having strong protections to protect people in the housing so people aren't being displaced. But we are going through a real period of tension around the role of local government and the role of the state. And as a former local elected official, like I said, I believe in local control. I think far more often than not, local communities are in a better position to make decisions than the state is. Far more often than not, but not always. And local control, it sometimes gets talked about in a very biblical way. It's just self-evident biblical about local control. But my view of local control is that local control is important when it delivers good results. And when it doesn't deliver good results, we have to take a second look at it. And it usually does deliver good results. But in the case of housing, we have adopted in California such an extreme version of local control that it has to be reevaluated, not to end local control. Some people have accused me or others of saying we want a state takeover of all land use. I don't want that. That would be a bad idea. I don't advocate that. We have to recalibrate the balance. If you look at other important areas of policy, let's talk about public education. If I were to come in here and say, I have a bill idea for you that I want you to endorse and help me get passed. I love local control so much that I want school districts to be able to decide how many days a year they educate their kids. If they want to do 100 days a year or 30 days a year, they can pick whatever they want. If they want to hire credentialed or non-credentialed teacher, whatever they want. I want to allow them to decide with no limitations what subjects they teach. If they don't want to teach math anymore, I was someone who I wasn't very good at math. Tried to get better, but I was not a math person. Fine, don't teach math. You would laugh me out of the room, right? We want our local school districts to be able to make local decisions, but the state sets standards. And local school districts operate within those standards because education is important across the state and it matters for the future of our state economically and otherwise. And in housing, which is as important as public education, we've taken the opposite approach. We've said state has little or no role Cities, you decide for yourself. If you don't want any new housing, that's fine. If you want just a little bit, that's fine. If you want to ban apartment buildings right by a subway station or a train station, that's fine. If you want to effectively ban poor people from your community, it's all good. You do it. And when the state has passed laws traditionally around housing, the state laws have had no teeth or been completely ignored. And what we're trying to do now is just tweak that balance. And to say, when it comes to zoning will still be local, but there will be minimum standards. You can't ban apartment buildings. This is a bill that I had this year, Senate Bill 827, that we're going to reintroduce. You can't ban apartment buildings right by a subway station. You can't, or right by a major job center. You just can't do that. It's not sustainable. So we're going to set minimum standards. You can go above those standards. You can have your own local decisions around inclusionary housing, around design, around all sorts of setbacks, all that kind of stuff. Totally local. But on the basic issue of how much housing you're allowing, there has to be certain minimum standards if we're going to get out of that 3.5 million hole. We also, we passed some housing streamlining, a bill that I authored, SB 35, to say that for communities that are not meeting the housing goals that have long been set by the state and by the regions, which have been totally toothless, if you're not meeting your housing goals, we're going to help you meet your housing goals by streamlining and accelerating the approval process to help you get caught up. So we're also around in-law units, accessory dwelling units, which have technically been required for 35 years. The state passed a law in the early 1980s saying cities are not allowed to stop people from putting in-law units in their homes. But that got ignored by almost every city in the state until recently, and we've started to put teeth into those laws. To say, when we say we want in-law units, we mean it. It's so important. It's a huge potential source of new housing. And then also putting some constraints on arbitrary denials of projects. When a community has zoned for and said in their housing element, this is going to be a site for a 20-unit building. That's part of our housing element. And then they either reject the project or say, no, we know we said 20 units, we really mean 3 units, that is not legal, that you have to actually comply with your own zoning. All of these issues are really hard, really, really hard. And in particular, for city council members, I know a lot of city council members, mayors, county supervisors all over the state. And my impression of local elected officials in this state, these are some of the most committed people you will ever meet, often with running for a job where you often get paid little or even nothing, so that your neighbors can be mad at you all the time about everything, and email you about everything, and ask you to fix all their problems. I once got an email asking me to deal with a skunk infestation in someone's backyard. And we have said as a state to city council members and to mayors, you need to approve housing, and I know they're saying they're going to recall you, and I know you represent 10,000 people, so it's not that hard to get a recall petition together or to really try to defeat you for re-election. You got to suck it up, and you better just approve these projects. That's what we're saying, as opposed to the state doing our job and trying to make local elected officials' lives a little bit easier by having these standards in place where you can go to your constituents and say, I know you don't like this project, but under state law, this project has to be approved. It changes the dynamic fundamentally, and it will allow us to create a lot more housing. I know that we can get there. We're already starting to, I think, make some progress. We are seeing an uptick in housing production in California. We're still not where we need to be, but it's happening. We see more and more cities that are starting to either do some rezoning or talk about rezoning. We see, and sometimes it results out of tragedy. You look at the North Bay and the horrendous fires that happened last year before the even worse tragedy that happened this year in terms of the number of homes that were burned. But in the North Bay, so many people lost their homes. And now the city of Santa Rosa has adopted a permit streamlining program that is getting awards. And Santa Rosa was never considered like a super gung-ho build more housing city. And now they have this horrible tragedy, and they're trying a really aggressive, innovative approach. We also need to do much, much more as a state to help particularly smaller cities adjust. We have so many cities that may have 1 or 2 planners in their entire city, and we're asking them to update their zoning, to adopt streamlining, to adopt objective design standards, to do all of these things that are not really that easy. And so we have been allocating more money from the state to give grants to larger cities, but particularly to the smaller cities, so that they can hire people, whether it's employees or outside consultants, to help them do that. It's not enough for us just to, scold cities and say, you better do this. We need to be a good partner and help. And we are really trying to provide more funding to the cities so that, cities like San Francisco, we have a large general fund. We fund a lot of affordable housing out of our own budget. There are so many cities that need housing for lower income people, subsidized housing, and they just don't have the local resources, and the state needs to step in and help provide those resources. And we need to get redevelopment going again so that we give cities all the tools they need to be able to do that. This is at the heart of California's future economy. When you look at employers who are telling us, I don't know if I can expand in California, and that, yes, everyone talks about the regulations and us liberal Democrats and what we require of them, but that's not the first thing they talk about. It's not taxes, it's not red tape. It's my workers can't find a place to live. Large employers who they don't want their employees commuting an hour and a half, and so they wonder, should I expand somewhere else instead? We're seeing in the Bay Area more and more retail stores, restaurants. There was a restaurant in San Francisco that just closed down, very successful restaurant, not because they lost their lease, but because they can't get enough servers and chefs, because they can't afford to live anywhere near. Starbucks has talked to me about their struggles because they have workers who are living far away and they end up just working at a Starbucks there, so they're having trouble staffing their stores. And so it's a real economic issue, and it is about climate, because if we don't have more housing density near jobs, near transit, we're never going to meet our climate goals. So we know what to do. We can do it. It's going to take time. It's one of the hardest things in politics. There's a huge incentive for elected officials to do things where you can deliver results in 6 months or a year and cut the ribbon and have everyone be happy. Housing is really hard because you're not going to solve it in a year or in a couple of years. It's taken us 50 years to get where we are. I don't think it's going to take us 50 years to get out, but it's going to take some time. And we have to have the political will to really just stay the course. Because, some people have said to me, it could take 10, 15, 20 years to really course correct on housing in California. So why should we do that? And my response is, well, if it's going to take 10 or 20 years, let's start today. When they say that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, the second best time is today. Let's do it today so that our kids and our grandkids have a better housing future than we do right now. And I know we can get there. I believe the political will is forming. We have more and more elected officials who believe in pro-housing agenda, and I think we're going to get there over time, and I look forward to working together and making that a reality. So thank you very much.
Hi, Esther Malkin with Monterey Peninsula Renters United. You just mentioned that we have a 10 to 20 year gap for the housing correction, and I represent the people who can't wait that long. Those of us that were kind of not expecting Prop 10 to pass, and now that we know that it didn't, we're curious what is going to be the next a plan of attack. I've met with Senator Monning locally before the elections, and everybody kept holding their breath, and now we're here. So what happens now?
Yeah. Well, my hope had been that if Prop 10 were going to lose, it would have been closer to maybe open up some negotiation opportunities in the legislature. But I think one thing that, again, rent control it's a very hard issue. I support rent control, and I always have in San Francisco. And but even in San Francisco, Prop 10 won like 52-48. So this is just a battle that gets fought throughout the state. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that when you look at Prop 10 and the effort to repeal Costa-Hawkins, yes, state law puts constraints on local communities' ability to enact rent control, but it's also important to keep in mind that local communities do have the ability to enact rent control. It's not as broad as some would like, but in San Francisco or Berkeley or Santa Monica, West Hollywood, et cetera, we have pretty robust rent control, even though some would like it to be broader. The vast majority of cities in California have chosen not to enact rent control. Those local disputes play out in different ways in different parts of the state. Even in the Bay Area, where the rent crisis is really awful, it's whenever it goes to the ballot, it loses more often than it wins. And so I think there's a slow shift going on there. But at the state level, given that local communities are not overwhelmingly enacting rent control, that creates a real challenge. I do think in the legislature there will be an effort this year to reform Costa-Hawkins, and I did not endorse Prop 10 because even though I would like to see changes to Costa-Hawkins, I didn't think a complete repeal was the right approach. Right now in San Francisco, for example, state law says whenever you adopted your rent control ordinance, and no later than 1995, that's the cutoff. Anything built before then is rent controlled, anything built after is not. So in San Francisco, 79 was when we adopted it. So if you live in a building built in 78, you're rent controlled. If it was built in 1980, you're not rent controlled, and that lasts forever. It never changes. And so I think that there is a good argument to have a rolling time period, whether it's 15, 20 years or something like that, so that developers can get a rate of return on their property. We want to create an incentive for people to build new apartments, but that over time, a city could choose to put the apartment into rent control. That's just my perspective. Some disagree with me, but that conversation will happen. I think there will likely be a bill, an anti-gouging bill. We have anti-gouging laws in California for disasters. Like you can't, if there's after the wildfires, you can't, as a landlord, raise someone's rent, more than I believe it's 10%. It's considered, just like you can't, for other things. If there's a disaster, you can't gouge. And so I've heard that there will be a bill to classify our housing crisis as essentially a natural disaster. It's not natural; it was very human-made. And to apply anti-gouging laws. Now that's still up to a 10% increase, which is a significant hike, but it's better than 20 or 30%, which is sometimes what we're seeing. There will once again be a bill to have statewide just cause protections, to say you cannot evict someone unless certain breaches of the lease, et cetera. These bills, by the way, have all failed in the legislature before. They often don't make it out of a single committee. So I don't know what's going to happen. I will say that we are, I think there's a lot of energy to have a broad housing package next year around zoning reforms and streamlining, funding for affordable housing, and some sort of additional protections for tenants. I don't know what those protections will look like, but it is very much on the agenda.
Right here. My name is Felipe Hernandez, City of Watsonville. I was wondering, is there any discussion or any chance that Governor Newsom will bring back RDA specifically for affordable housing?
I hope so. So my own assembly member, David Chu, had a bill in the legislature this year to bring back redevelopment for affordable housing and for infrastructure. And when it was really just one of those horrible political failures when redevelopment was ended. There were definitely abuses, for sure, and we all are aware of some of those abuses. But there were definitely there were cities that were doing it right. That were using it for housing, for supportive infrastructure. And when that went away, it just took away an incredibly powerful tool to fund housing and infrastructure. It was never going to come back under Governor Brown. He was just not supportive. And I think the bill that was introduced this year by David Chu, I think it was more of a let's do a warm-up and start the conversation. So it didn't make it that far, but it was a start. So there will be, I suspect there are going to be multiple redevelopment bills introduced this year. It's definitely a popular topic, as it should be. And I've not spoken to the governor-elect about it, but he comes out of San Francisco as a supervisor and a mayor in a city where we really aggressively used redevelopment to build affordable housing. So he's seen it firsthand, and I'm optimistic that he'll at least be open to something.
Mr. Senator, thank you for your time here today. Affordable Housing Sustainability, Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant Program is a wonderful tool, but it's my opinion, sorry, my name's John, I'm a council member-elect here in Seaside.
Congratulations.
It's my opinion that it's deficient in using specifically the CalEnviro screen and not looking at some of the other factors that might help this region specifically get some of those dollars to create affordable housing opportunities.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you can do in the Senate to either work on additional tools or a different way to calculate those numbers or to make the pot bigger. What are the options we can achieve so that that tool becomes something that we can use here locally?
Well, we definitely want to make the pot bigger, but so CalEnviro screen, I don't know, people may not know what the CalEnviro screen, and I, you know, Senator Monning is, even though he's an honorary member, well, he has a little piece of the Bay Area, so when we caucus as Bay Area senators, we always invite Senator Monning, and he comes, so he's a very good colleague. CalEnviro screen was adopted, so we have parts of the state that are very high poverty and heavily polluted. In the Central Valley, in the Inland Empire, parts of LA County, there are areas of the state that we, like in the Bay Area, we have a lot of, low-income people, a lot of poor people, but many of them at least live in areas where they're breathing clean air, with some exceptions. So the Enviro screen was created to say when we're particularly talking about funding for environmental remediation and for parks, and let's have a screen where we really prioritize communities that are facing major environmental contamination, where you have kids who are in school and like their playground is right next to a freeway. So they're breathing in that exhaust every day, and they're really high asthma rates. And I totally support that. I think when we talk about our environmental remediation and making sure that people can breathe clean air, we do need to focus on the areas that are most impacted. The problem, and so EnviroScreen definitely favors Southern California, Central Valley, Inland Empire, LA. The problem is that we see what I call CalEnviroScreen creep, where all of a sudden it's used as this okay, we now have this tool to allocate funding, and it gets applied in areas that it never should have been applied. So CalEnviroScreen should not be applied to affordable housing funding, right? Whether you have clean air or dirty air, people are struggling with housing in the Bay Area, in the Monterey, Santa Cruz region, and everywhere. But it started creeping. We, as a Bay Area delegation, because the Bay Area, like I think this region, we get really harmed by EnviroScreen. We get the original version of CalEnviroScreen, no neighborhood in San Francisco, even our most impoverished areas, qualify. It got a little bit tweaked and improved. We have started to band together and make a lot of noise about not allowing CalEnviroScreen to go beyond where it was supposed to be, and we've had some success in doing that. We're going to continue to try to keep this tool limited to what it was supposed to be. It's always a big regional fight, but we do need to expand the pie. I think we have 5 minutes, so.
So, hi, Andy Myrick, City of Salinas. So, my question is, and you've got a lot of policy ideas out there, and most of them I find, I agree with them or they're tolerable. On the local preemption, particularly with regards to zoning and density. So, a lot of the solutions you're talking about, the problem you keep defining it as the neighbors are objecting or it can't get the political will. But there are other cities that have already made this a by right use, but have established certain densities, and those densities may have been established because of more practical concerns, such as maybe the sewer system can only handle so much, the roads are only so wide, there's infrastructure constraints, there could be topographical constraints. And when you're looking at doing a one-size-fits-all, you've got that unintended consequences effect. So my question is, what are you and your staff doing to reach out to local governments and local areas to find out what are the potential unintended side effects in a particular area that could be caused by that kind of policy? And how are you actually, adjusting your bill to try to accommodate that?
Sure, and I appreciate that. And first of all, I'll say thank you for sending Ana Caballero to the Senate. I'm really looking forward to working with her. And Robert Rivas as well, really two outstanding people. For Salinas, we would welcome specific feedback. I'm happy to meet and talk. We've met with a lot of different mayors and city council members, so we would welcome that just to start out with. And we have, in the zoning bill over the course of this year, we made quite a few adjustments to the bill in direct response to feedback from local governments, and we got some very detailed feedback, and which often had really good points, and we would incorporate that into the bill, as well as from tenant advocates and others. So we were very much an open door, and we welcome specific feedback. One of the ways that we adjusted the bill was initially the bill said if you're within a half a mile of fixed rail or a quarter mile of a high quality bus stop, like a frequent bus stop, you couldn't zone below a certain height, and you couldn't limit the density. We eliminated the height change to be triggered by bus stops. So right now, the way the bill, when it died, and what it will be, is that if within a quarter mile of a bus stop, density is relaxed, but the local height limit remains. So it's a lower touch kind of situation. And in smaller communities, that tends to be the case because there is fixed rail in a lot of different kinds of communities, but buses are much more prevalent. In terms of infrastructure, it's a challenging one. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg because we hear it with the capacity of school systems or roads and traffic or sewer systems, whatever the case may be, and people hesitating to add more housing until the infrastructure is in place. But that usually doesn't happen. They don't always you want them to travel perfectly in tandem, that as housing goes up, the infrastructure follows it step by step. That's just not the reality of how society tends to operate. But as you get more people, the demands for infrastructure improvements become very intense, and the infrastructure improves. That's, and we're trying to, we've increased infrastructure investment a lot in California. We passed SB 1 for $5.2 billion a year in new transportation funding. Thank you to the voters for rejecting Prop 6. We also have increased other forms of infrastructure funding, and there's more work to do, but we would welcome specific feedback from Salinas on some of the concerns that you may have, and we will look forward to seeing that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a big round of applause for Senator Wiener.
Thank you.